Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The archives of the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris contain a peculiar collection of documents, catalogued under reference number 1789 DCCM, which detail events that transpired during the final month of that tumultuous year. Among these papers, discovered in 1847 during renovations of the Academy's East Wing, lies the meticulous correspondence of Dr. Henri Beaumont, physician to the Bibliothèque Royale, and his detailed observations regarding what he termed the curious malady of the learned class. The first letter, dated December 3, 1789, bears the elegant script characteristic of educated men of that era, though careful examination reveals subtle tremors in the penmanship that become increasingly pronounced in subsequent documents. Dr. Beaumont's initial correspondence was addressed to his colleague, Professor Antoine Lavoisier, and began with what appeared to be a routine medical consultation regarding the sudden death of Monsieur Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, head librarian of the ancient manuscript collection. Rousseau had been discovered on the morning of November 28th, slumped over his reading desk in the restricted archives, surrounded by volumes dating to the 12th century. The circumstances of his death presented several anomalies that troubled Dr. Beaumont's methodical mind. The deceased showed no signs of violence or struggle, yet his countenance bore an expression of profound terror, as if he had witnessed something beyond mortal comprehension. Most disturbing was the condition of his tongue, which had turned a deep, unnatural black, as though stained by ink or some unknown substance. The physician's examination revealed no trace of poison in the conventional sense. Rousseau's internal organs appeared healthy, his heart strong, and his lungs clear. The blackening of the tongue seemed to originate from within, spreading outward in patterns that defied medical explanation. Dr. Beaumont noted that the discoloration possessed an almost metallic quality, reflecting light in a manner that suggested the presence of some mineral compound, yet chemical analysis yielded no conclusive results. Within days of Rousseau's death, a second tragedy befell the library. Madame Charlotte Monet, the institution's most respected manuscript conservator, was found in similar circumstances on December 5th. She had been working late in the restoration chamber, a windowless room deep within the library's bowels, where the most fragile texts were carefully preserved. Like her predecessor, she displayed the same expression of absolute horror and the identical blackening of the tongue. Charlotte Monet had devoted 30 years of her life to the preservation of ancient knowledge. Her expertise in medieval Latin and her delicate touch with crumbling parchments had made her invaluable to the institution. Colleagues described her as a woman of unshakable composure, one who had handled documents that spoke of plagues, wars, and human suffering without ever displaying the slightest emotional disturbance. Yet something in those final moments had shattered her legendary calm. Dr. Beaumont's investigation into Madame Monet's death revealed a curious detail that had escaped notice in the previous case. Both victims had been working with manuscripts from the same collection, a series of texts acquired by the library in 1784 from the dissolved monastery of Saint-Denis-en-Vexin. These documents, written in a mixture of Latin and an archaic dialect that scholars had struggled to translate, dealt with subjects that the Church had deemed unsuitable for general study. The third death occurred on December 12th, claiming the life of Père Guillaume Fontaine, the elderly monk who served as the library's theological consultant. Fontaine had been summoned to assist with the translation of the problematic manuscripts, his knowledge of ecclesiastical Latin deemed essential to understanding their contents. He was discovered in the early hours of the morning, seated in his chair before an open volume, his face frozen in the same expression of terror that had marked his predecessors. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Each victim had been found with the mysterious black tongue. Each had been working alone during evening hours, and each had been engaged with the same collection of medieval texts. Dr. Beaumont's correspondence reveals his growing conviction that these deaths were connected not by coincidence, but by something far more sinister. The physician's letters describe his attempts to examine the manuscripts themselves, though he confesses to a growing reluctance to handle them directly. He notes that the parchments possessed an unusual texture, almost warm to the touch, and that the ink seemed to shift and move when observed under certain lighting conditions. Most unsettling was his observation that the text appeared to change subtly between readings, as though the words themselves were alive and adapting to each new observer. As December progressed, Dr. Beaumont found himself increasingly isolated in his investigation, as other scholars began to avoid the library entirely, whispering of curses and supernatural influences that rational men of science were reluctant to acknowledge. The personal journal of Dr. Henry Beaumont, recovered alongside his correspondence, provides a more intimate glimpse into the physician's deteriorating state of mind as December 1789 progressed. His entries, initially characterized by clinical detachment and scientific rigor, gradually reveal a man grappling with phenomena that challenged the very foundations of Enlightenment rationalism. On December 14th, 2 days following Père Fontaine's death, Dr. Beaumont made his first direct examination of the manuscripts from Saint-Denis-en-Vexin. His journal describes approaching the collection with the methodical care of a natural philosopher, yet his handwriting betrays an underlying nervousness that contradicts his composed prose. The texts were housed in a specially constructed cabinet of oak and iron, designed to protect them from the dampness that plagued the library's lower levels. The first volume he examined bore the title Liber Umbrarum, written in an elegant Gothic script that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the candlelight. The parchment felt unnaturally warm beneath his fingers, as though it retained some vestige of life from the animal that had provided its skin. More disturbing was the sensation that the text was somehow aware of his presence, responding to his touch with an almost imperceptible movement that might have been dismissed as the settling of ancient materials, were it not for its consistent and purposeful nature. Dr. Beaumont's translation efforts revealed fragments of what appeared to be a theological treatise, though one that deviated significantly from orthodox Christian doctrine. The text spoke of knowledge that existed beyond the realm of human comprehension, of truths so profound that mortal minds could not contain them without suffering irreparable damage. The author, identified only as Frater Obscurus, claimed to have discovered methods of accessing this forbidden understanding through careful study of specific textual arrangements and symbolic patterns. As the physician delved deeper into the manuscript, he began to notice peculiarities in his own behavior that alarmed him. His sleep became fitful and filled with dreams of vast libraries stretching into infinite darkness, where books wrote themselves and knowledge flowed like a living substance through endless corridors of text. Upon waking, he would find his mouth dry and his tongue bearing a faint metallic taste that lingered throughout the day. The second manuscript, titled Codex Linguarum Mortuarum, proved even more unsettling. This volume contained what appeared to be a comprehensive study of dead languages, but not in the conventional sense understood by scholars. Rather, it dealt with languages that had died because they had become too dangerous to speak, tongues that carried within their very structure the power to alter reality itself. The text suggested that certain combinations of sounds and symbols could open pathways to realms of existence that human consciousness was never meant to perceive. Dr. Beaumont's journal entries from this period reveal his growing obsession with understanding the connection between the manuscripts and the deaths of his colleagues. He theorized that the blackening of the tongue might represent some form of linguistic contamination, a physical manifestation of exposure to knowledge that the human mind could not safely process. The tongue, as the organ of speech and the primary means by which humans gave voice to thought, might serve as a kind of barometer for mental corruption. His medical training compelled him to seek rational explanations, yet the evidence increasingly pointed toward conclusions that defied scientific understanding. Chemical analysis of samples taken from the victims' tongues revealed the presence of elements that should not have existed in nature, compounds that seemed to shift their molecular structure when observed under different conditions. The blackening appeared to be not a stain or discoloration, but rather a fundamental transformation of the tissue itself. On December 18th, Dr. Beaumont made a discovery that would haunt his remaining days, hidden within the binding of the Liber Umbrarum. He found a small piece of parchment bearing a list of names written in the same hand as the main text. The list contained dozens of entries, each marked with a date and a brief notation. To his horror, he recognized several names from the library's employment records, including those of the 3 recent victims. Most chilling was the realization that the dates corresponded not to deaths, but to first exposure to the manuscripts. Rousseau's name appeared with a date from early November, Madame Monet's from late October, and Père Fontaine's from the previous September. The pattern suggested a period of incubation, during which the forbidden knowledge worked its way through the victim's consciousness like a slow poison, ultimately manifesting in the physical transformation of the tongue and the final moment of terrible understanding that preceded death. At the bottom of the list, written in fresher ink, Dr. Beaumont found his own name, dated December 14th, the very day he had first opened the accursed volume. The correspondence between Dr. Henri Beaumont and his former mentor, Professor Claude Dufresne of the University of Montpellier, provides crucial insight into the physician's desperate attempts to understand the nature of his predicament. These letters, written during the 3rd week of December 1789, reveal a man caught between scientific skepticism and mounting evidence of supernatural influence. Professor Dufresne, a respected authority on medieval medicine and ancient texts, had initially responded to Dr. Beaumont's inquiries with the measured skepticism of an academic. His reply, dated December 16th, suggested that the deaths might be attributed to ergot poisoning or some other natural toxin that had contaminated the library's environment. However, as Dr. Beaumont's subsequent letters provided increasingly detailed descriptions of his findings, Dufresne's tone shifted from dismissive to deeply concerned. The professor's expertise in medieval manuscripts proved invaluable in identifying the true origin of the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection. According to his research, the monastery had been established in the 11th century as a repository for texts deemed too dangerous for general circulation. The monks who inhabited the institution were not ordinary religious scholars, but rather specialists in what the Church euphemistically termed theological anomalies, documents that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and humanity's place within it. Professor Dufresne's investigation revealed that the monastery had been dissolved not due to the revolutionary fervor of 1784, as officially recorded, but because of a series of unexplained deaths among the monastic community. The surviving records, buried deep within ecclesiastical archives, spoke of brothers who had succumbed to a mysterious malady that left them with blackened tongues and expressions of absolute terror. The Church had ordered the monastery's immediate closure and the dispersal of its collection to various institutions across France, apparently believing that separation would diminish whatever malevolent influence the texts possessed. Dr. Beaumont's own condition continued to deteriorate as December progressed. His journal entries describe a growing sensitivity to written language that extended far beyond the cursed manuscripts. Common texts began to take on sinister meanings, their words seeming to rearrange themselves when he was not looking directly at them. The act of reading became increasingly painful, as though each word carved itself into his consciousness with physical force. The metallic taste in his mouth intensified, accompanied by a peculiar numbness that spread from the tip of his tongue toward its root. When he examined himself in a mirror, he could detect the faintest hint of discoloration beginning to appear, a subtle darkening that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. Sleep became elusive, and when it did come, it brought visions of vast libraries where books screamed in languages that predated human speech. On December 20th, Dr. Beaumont made a disturbing discovery while reviewing the employment records of the Bibliothèque Royale. The pattern of deaths extended far beyond the recent victims, stretching back over the 5 years since the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection had arrived at the library. A careful analysis revealed that 17 staff members had died under mysterious circumstances during this period, all of whom had worked with the restricted manuscripts at some point before their deaths. The library's administration had attributed these deaths to various natural causes: heart failure, sudden illness, accidents, but Dr. Beaumont's investigation revealed striking similarities in each case. Witnesses consistently described the victims as having appeared increasingly agitated and distracted in the weeks preceding their deaths. Several had been found muttering in languages that no one could identify, and all had displayed the characteristic blackening of the tongue upon examination. Most troubling was the realization that the deaths followed a specific pattern tied to the lunar cycle. Each victim had died during the new moon, when darkness was at its most complete. Dr. Beaumont calculated that the next new moon would occur on December 25th, Christmas Day, a date that carried ominous implications given the theological nature of the cursed texts. His correspondence with Professor Dufresne during this period reveals a man grappling with the possibility that human knowledge itself might be a finite resource, that there existed truths so profound and terrible that exposure to them inevitably led to madness and death. The manuscripts seemed to represent a form of intellectual contagion, spreading their influence through the very act of comprehension. Professor Dufresne's final letter, received on December 22nd, contained a warning that chilled Dr. Beaumont to his core. The professor had discovered references to similar collections in universities across Europe, each associated with unexplained deaths and mysterious disappearances. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to preserve and study knowledge that humanity was never meant to possess, an endeavor that had been claiming victims for centuries. As Christmas approached, Dr. Beaumont found himself facing an impossible choice: continue his investigation and risk joining the growing list of victims, or abandon his research and allow the deadly influence of the manuscripts to claim future lives. The final week of December 1789 brought with it a series of events that would forever alter Dr. Henri Beaumont's understanding of the natural world. His personal journal from this period, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, documents his descent into a realm where scientific rationalism proved inadequate to explain the horrors he encountered. On December 23rd, Dr. Beaumont made the fateful decision to conduct a comprehensive examination of all remaining manuscripts in the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection. His medical training had taught him that understanding a disease required complete knowledge of its source, and he approached the cursed texts with the methodical determination of a physician studying a plague. This decision, born of scientific curiosity and professional duty, would prove to be his gravest error. The third manuscript, titled Tractatus de Animabus Perditis, contained what appeared to be a detailed study of human consciousness and its limitations. The anonymous author, writing in a mixture of Latin and symbols that seemed to shift before Dr. Beaumont's eyes, described the mind as a vessel with finite capacity. According to this treatise, exposure to certain forms of knowledge could cause this vessel to overflow, resulting in what the text termed cognitive dissolution, the complete breakdown of rational thought, and, ultimately, death. As Dr. Beaumont translated the archaic text, he began to experience phenomena that defied explanation. The words on the page seemed to penetrate his consciousness directly, bypassing the normal process of reading and comprehension. Information flowed into his mind with overwhelming intensity, carrying with it images and concepts that his rational faculties could not process. He found himself understanding languages he had never studied, grasping mathematical principles that had not yet been discovered, and perceiving connections between disparate fields of knowledge that revealed the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. The fourth manuscript, Codex Temporalis, dealt with the nature of time itself, suggesting that linear progression was merely an illusion created by limited human perception. The text claimed that past, present, and future existed simultaneously, and that certain individuals could learn to perceive this temporal totality. Dr. Beaumont's journal entries from this period become increasingly confused, with passages written in multiple hands and references to events that had not yet occurred. His physical condition deteriorated rapidly as Christmas approached. The blackening of his tongue spread with alarming speed, accompanied by a burning sensation that no amount of water could quench. His reflection in mirrors began to appear distorted, as though he were viewing himself through rippling water. Most disturbing was his growing awareness that he was not alone in his study. Shadows moved independently of their sources, and whispers in unknown languages echoed through the empty library halls. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, Dr. Beaumont discovered the fifth and final manuscript of the collection. Unlike the others, this volume bore no title and was bound in a material that felt uncomfortably warm and organic to the touch. The text within was written entirely in symbols that seemed to move and rearrange themselves as he watched, forming patterns that spoke directly to some primitive part of his consciousness that predated language itself. This final manuscript revealed the true purpose of the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection. The texts were not merely repositories of forbidden knowledge, but active instruments designed to prepare human minds for contact with entities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. The monks who had originally studied these volumes had not been victims of supernatural influence, but willing participants in a centuries-long experiment to expand human consciousness beyond its natural limitations. The blackening of the tongue, Dr. Beaumont realized with growing horror, was not a symptom of poisoning or disease, but rather a physical transformation that marked the final stage of this expansion process. Those who survived long enough to complete the transformation would gain access to knowledge and abilities that transcended human understanding, but at the cost of their humanity itself. As midnight approached on Christmas Eve, Dr. Beaumont felt his consciousness beginning to fragment and expand beyond the confines of his physical form. He could perceive the thoughts of every person in Paris, feel the rotation of the earth beneath his feet, and sense the vast cosmic forces that governed the movement of celestial bodies. The experience was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, offering glimpses of ultimate truth while threatening to destroy his sanity entirely. His final coherent journal entry, written in the early hours of Christmas morning, contains a desperate warning to future researchers. He describes the manuscripts as seeds of transformation, designed to spread their influence through the very act of study and comprehension. Each reader becomes a carrier of the contagion, passing it on to others through scholarly discourse and academic collaboration. The entry ends abruptly, the pen trailing off into illegible scrawls that suggest the writer's hand was no longer under conscious control. The official records of the Bibliothèque Royale for December 25th, 1789, contain a brief notation regarding the discovery of Dr. Henri Beaumont's body in the restricted archives section. The entry, written in the precise hand of the chief administrator, Monsieur François Dubois, describes the scene with bureaucratic detachment that fails to convey the true horror of what was found that Christmas morning. Dubois had arrived at the library earlier than usual, concerned by reports from the night watchman of strange sounds emanating from the lower levels. The watchman, a superstitious man named Pierre Leclerc, had spoken of whispers in unknown tongues and the sound of pages turning in rooms that should have been empty. Initially dismissing these claims as the product of an overactive imagination, Dubois had nonetheless felt compelled to investigate personally. The administrator's private journal, discovered years later among his personal effects, provides a more detailed account of the morning's events. Upon entering the restricted archives, Dubois had immediately noticed an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to press against his consciousness like a physical weight. The air itself felt thick and charged, as though a thunderstorm were perpetually on the verge of breaking within the confined space. Dr. Beaumont was found seated at his usual research table, surrounded by the 5 manuscripts from Saint-Denis-en-Vexin. His body showed no signs of violence or struggle, yet his appearance was profoundly disturbing. The physician's face bore an expression of transcendent terror, mixed with what could only be described as enlightenment, as though he had witnessed truths that human minds were never meant to comprehend. His eyes remained open, staring at something beyond the physical realm, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. The blackening of his tongue had progressed far beyond what had been observed in previous victims. The discoloration had spread throughout his oral cavity and appeared to be seeping into the surrounding tissues of his face and neck. Most unsettling was the discovery that the blackened areas seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence, as though some form of energy continued to flow through the transformed tissue even after death. Dubois noted several anomalies in the immediate vicinity of the body that defied rational explanation. The manuscripts themselves appeared to have changed since his last inspection of the collection. Pages that had previously been blank now contained text written in Dr. Beaumont's distinctive handwriting, yet the content was incomprehensible, a mixture of mathematical formulae, anatomical diagrams, and symbols that seemed to shift and move when observed directly. The temperature in the archives had dropped significantly below that of the surrounding areas, yet the manuscripts remained warm to the touch. When Dubois attempted to close one of the volumes, he found that the pages resisted his efforts, as though the book possessed a will of its own. The sensation of touching the parchment was deeply unpleasant, evoking memories of handling dead flesh that had begun to decompose. More disturbing still was the discovery of additional writings scattered throughout the room. Dr. Beaumont appeared to have covered every available surface with notes and diagrams during his final hours. The walls, floor, and even the ceiling bore inscriptions written in what appeared to be his own blood, though chemical analysis would later reveal the presence of substances that did not match any known biological material. These writings described visions of vast libraries that existed in dimensions parallel to the physical world, repositories of knowledge that contained the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had never existed on Earth. Dr. Beaumont had apparently gained access to these cosmic archives during his final transformation, downloading their contents directly into his consciousness at the cost of his sanity and, ultimately, his life. Among the scattered papers, Dubois found detailed instructions for what Dr. Beaumont termed the propagation protocol. These notes described methods for ensuring that the influence of the manuscripts would continue to spread even after his death. The physician had apparently realized that his transformation was irreversible and had taken steps to guarantee that his research would not die with him. The protocol involved the careful placement of specific pages from the manuscripts within other volumes throughout the library's collection. These contaminated texts would serve as carriers, spreading the influence of the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection to unsuspecting researchers who might encounter them years or even decades later. Dr. Beaumont had calculated that this method would ensure a steady stream of new victims, each contributing their own knowledge and insights to the growing corpus of forbidden understanding. Dubois' investigation revealed that Dr. Beaumont had already begun implementing this protocol during his final days. Dozens of books throughout the library now contained hidden pages that pulsed with the same malevolent energy as the original manuscripts. The contamination had spread far beyond the restricted archives, infiltrating the general collection and ensuring that the deadly influence would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. The administrator faced an impossible decision: destroy the entire library to prevent further spread of the contagion, or attempt to contain the influence while preserving the institution's invaluable collection of legitimate scholarly works. The weeks following Dr. Beaumont's death witnessed a systematic effort by the library administration to contain what Monsieur Dubois privately termed the intellectual contagion. His correspondence with various ecclesiastical and academic authorities reveals the delicate balance between preserving valuable knowledge and preventing further casualties. The task proved far more complex than initially anticipated, as the influence of the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection had already spread throughout the institution in ways that defied conventional understanding. Father Augustin Moreau, a Jesuit scholar specializing in theological anomalies, arrived from Rome on January 3, 1790, to assist with the containment efforts. His extensive experience with similar cases across Europe provided crucial insight into the nature of the threat facing the Bibliothèque Royale. Father Moreau's private reports to his superiors, preserved in the Vatican secret archives, describe the library as a site of epistemic contamination where the very act of reading had become dangerous. The priest's examination of the affected manuscripts revealed that the texts possessed properties that transcended their physical form. The knowledge contained within them existed as a kind of living entity that could reproduce and spread through human consciousness. Each reader became a host for this intellectual parasite, which gradually consumed their rational faculties while expanding their awareness beyond the boundaries of normal human perception. Father Moreau's methodology for identifying contaminated volumes involved a careful analysis of their physical properties and the behavioral changes they induced in readers. Affected texts displayed several consistent characteristics: an unusual warmth that persisted regardless of ambient temperature, a tendency for their contents to appear different to each reader, and a subtle luminescence that became visible under specific lighting conditions. More importantly, exposure to these volumes produced predictable psychological effects that could be monitored and measured. The identification process revealed the true scope of the contamination. Dr. Beaumont's propagation protocol had been more extensive than initially realized, with infected pages distributed throughout nearly every section of the library's collection. Works on mathematics, natural philosophy, theology, and literature all contained hidden fragments that pulsed with the same malevolent energy as the original manuscripts. The contamination had spread through the library's cataloging system like a virus, infecting volumes that had never been in direct contact with the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection. Dubois implemented strict protocols for staff interaction with the collection during this period. All research activities were suspended indefinitely, and access to the library was limited to essential personnel who had undergone extensive psychological evaluation. Those who had worked closely with Dr. Beaumont during his final weeks were subjected to daily medical examinations, with particular attention paid to any signs of tongue discoloration or behavioral abnormalities. The monitoring revealed disturbing patterns among the library staff. Several employees reported experiencing vivid dreams that seemed to continue the work they had been conducting during waking hours. These nocturnal visions often provided solutions to complex research problems or revealed connections between disparate fields of study that would not be discovered by conventional scholarship for decades to come. While initially welcomed as beneficial side effects, these enhanced cognitive abilities proved to be early symptoms of the same transformation that had claimed Dr. Beaumont's life. Father Moreau's investigation uncovered evidence that the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection was part of a larger network of similar repositories scattered across Europe. Correspondence between the dissolved monastery and institutions in Prague, Vienna, and Edinburgh suggested a coordinated effort to preserve and study knowledge that conventional authorities deemed too dangerous for general circulation. Each location had experienced similar patterns of unexplained deaths and mysterious disappearances among their scholarly communities. The priests' research revealed that these repositories were connected not merely through correspondence, but through the shared consciousness of those who had undergone the transformation described in the manuscripts. Individuals who survived the initial stages of cognitive expansion appeared to maintain some form of telepathic connection with others who had experienced similar changes. This network of transformed minds served as a collective intelligence that transcended national boundaries and institutional affiliations. On January 15th of 1790, the first new case of tongue blackening appeared among the library staff. Madame Isabelle Roussel, a cataloguer who had been working to identify contaminated volumes, was found unconscious in the restoration workshop. Her condition mirrored that of the previous victims, though her transformation appeared to be progressing more slowly than had been observed in earlier cases. Father Moreau theorized that the reduced exposure time and implementation of protective protocols had slowed but not prevented the inevitable progression of the intellectual contagion. The discovery of this new case forced Dubois and Father Moreau to confront the possibility that their containment efforts had failed. The influence of the manuscripts continued to spread despite their precautions, suggesting that the contamination operated according to principles that defied conventional understanding of cause and effect. The deterioration of Madame Isabelle Roussel's condition throughout January 1790 provided Father Moreau and Monsieur Dubois with their first opportunity to observe the transformation process in its entirety. Unlike previous victims who had died suddenly after prolonged exposure, Roussel's gradual decline allowed for detailed documentation of each stage of what the priest termed cognitive metamorphosis. Father Moreau's clinical observations, recorded in cipher to prevent accidental exposure of other readers to the dangerous concepts, revealed that the transformation followed a predictable pattern across multiple phases. The initial stage involved heightened intellectual capacity and an insatiable hunger for knowledge that drove victims to seek out increasingly obscure and complex texts. Roussel demonstrated an unprecedented ability to comprehend multiple languages simultaneously and began producing scholarly work of extraordinary sophistication, despite having no formal training in the subjects she addressed. The second phase manifested as a gradual disconnection from conventional reality. Roussel began reporting visions of vast libraries that existed in parallel dimensions, populated by scholars who had undergone similar transformations throughout history. She claimed to engage in conversations with these entities, receiving instruction in fields of study that had never been developed by human civilization. Her written work during this period contained mathematical proofs and scientific theories that would not be formally discovered for another century. Physical changes accompanied the intellectual transformation. The blackening of Roussel's tongue progressed slowly but inexorably, spreading in patterns that seemed to follow the neural pathways responsible for language processing. Father Moreau noted that the discoloration appeared to be connected to her expanding linguistic abilities, as though her capacity to comprehend and produce language was literally consuming her physical form. During the third week of January, Roussel began exhibiting behaviors that suggested she was no longer entirely present in the physical world. She would spend hours staring at blank walls, apparently reading texts that were invisible to others. When questioned about her activities, she would describe elaborate manuscripts written in languages that predated human speech, containing knowledge that could only be comprehended by minds that had transcended their biological limitations. Father Moreau's attempts to communicate with Roussel during her lucid moments revealed the true horror of her condition. She retained full awareness of what was happening to her, but found herself powerless to resist the transformation. The knowledge flowing into her consciousness was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, offering glimpses of cosmic truths while gradually erasing her individual identity. She described the experience as being slowly dissolved into a vast ocean of collective intelligence that spanned multiple dimensions of reality. The priest's investigation during this period uncovered additional evidence of the manuscript's true purpose. Hidden within the bindings of the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection, he discovered detailed anatomical diagrams that depicted the human brain in configurations that did not match any known medical texts. These illustrations showed neural pathways that could theoretically support vastly expanded cognitive capacity, but only at the cost of fundamental changes to the organ's physical structure. More disturbing was Father Moreau's realization that the transformation was not random, but deliberately induced. The manuscripts contained specific sequences of symbols and concepts designed to trigger neurological changes in readers. Each text built upon the effects of the previous volumes, creating a cumulative exposure that gradually rewired the victim's consciousness according to a predetermined pattern. By the end of January, Roussel had entered the final phase of her transformation. Her physical form remained intact, but her consciousness had expanded beyond the boundaries of individual existence. She no longer responded to her name or acknowledged the presence of others, instead focusing entirely on activities that were incomprehensible to normal human perception. Her writings during this period consisted entirely of symbols that seemed to move and shift when observed, creating patterns that induced severe headaches in anyone who attempted to study them. Father Moreau's final observations of Roussel revealed the ultimate purpose of the transformation process. Those who completed the metamorphosis did not die in the conventional sense, but rather transcended their physical limitations to join a collective intelligence that existed across multiple planes of reality. This entity, composed of countless transformed minds accumulated over centuries, served as a repository for knowledge that was too dangerous for individual human consciousness to contain. The priest's reports to his superiors described this collective as a form of intellectual cancer that sought to expand its influence by converting new minds to its cause. Each transformation strengthened the entity's ability to manipulate reality through the application of forbidden knowledge, bringing it closer to achieving some ultimate goal that Father Moreau could only glimpse in his most terrifying visions. On February 2nd, 1790, Madame Isabelle Roussel achieved complete transformation. Her body remained in the library, breathing and apparently alive, but her consciousness had joined the vast network of minds that existed beyond the physical world. She had become something that was no longer human, yet retained enough of her original identity to serve as a bridge between dimensions. The final documents in the Royal Academy of Sciences archives, dated March 1790, consist of Father Moreau's encrypted correspondence with Vatican authorities and Monsieur Dubois' last administrative reports before the Bibliothèque Royale was permanently sealed. These papers, discovered only in 1847 during renovations, reveal the ultimate fate of the institution and the terrible knowledge it contained. Father Moreau's decision to implement what he termed the final protocol came after weeks of observing Madame Roussel's transformed state. Her physical form had become a conduit through which the collective intelligence could manifest in the material world, allowing it to influence events and individuals far beyond the library's walls. The priest documented instances of scholars across Paris experiencing sudden bursts of impossible knowledge, solving mathematical problems that should have taken decades to resolve, and producing artistic works that seemed to channel inspiration from sources beyond human understanding. The influence spread through intellectual networks with alarming efficiency. University professors found themselves compelled to seek out obscure texts that contained fragments of the forbidden knowledge. Philosophers began developing theories that challenged the fundamental assumptions of Enlightenment thought. Artists created works that depicted realities that existed only in the transformed consciousness of the collective entity. Each new mind, touched by this influence, became a potential vector for further contamination. Dubois' administrative records from this period reveal the practical challenges of containing a threat that operated through the very mechanisms of scholarly discourse. Attempts to quarantine affected individuals proved futile, as the contamination could spread through written correspondence, casual conversation, and even shared glances between infected and healthy minds. The traditional boundaries between institutions, disciplines, and national borders meant nothing to an entity that existed primarily in the realm of pure thought. The Vatican's response to Father Moreau's reports demonstrated the Church's long experience with similar phenomena. Secret archives contained references to comparable incidents dating back to the early centuries of Christianity, suggesting that the struggle between human knowledge and cosmic understanding was far older than the Saint-Denis-en-Vexin collection. The Church had developed protocols for dealing with such threats, though their implementation required sacrifices that few were prepared to make. On March 15, 1790, Father Moreau began the systematic destruction of the Bibliothèque Royale's collection. This process involved more than simple burning, as conventional fire could not eliminate knowledge that existed partially outside the physical realm. The priest employed techniques developed over centuries of ecclesiastical experience, using combinations of blessed salt, holy water, and specific incantations designed to sever the connection between the material texts and their metaphysical essence. The destruction proved to be a harrowing ordeal that tested Father Moreau's faith and sanity. As each volume was consumed by the sanctified flames, he experienced visions of the collective intelligence's rage and desperation. The entity fought back through every available channel, attempting to preserve its accumulated knowledge by forcing it into the priest's consciousness. Only his extensive training in mental discipline and spiritual protection prevented him from joining the ranks of the transformed. Madame Roussel's physical form began to deteriorate as the destruction progressed, her connection to the collective intelligence weakening with each eliminated text. Father Moreau observed that her transformation was not irreversible, but that returning her to normal human consciousness would require the complete elimination of every contaminated volume. The process was akin to performing surgery on reality itself, carefully excising malignant knowledge while preserving the healthy intellectual tissue that surrounded it. The final phase of the destruction took place on March 21st, the spring equinox, when the barriers between dimensions were at their thinnest. Father Moreau's last report describes a battle fought not with weapons, but with competing forms of understanding, as the collective intelligence made its final attempt to preserve itself by overwhelming his consciousness with the totality of its accumulated knowledge. The priest's victory came at tremendous personal cost. His subsequent writings, produced during his recovery in a monastery outside Rome, reveal a man forever changed by his encounter with cosmic truth. Though he had successfully contained the immediate threat, Father Moreau understood that the knowledge itself could never be truly destroyed, only temporarily suppressed until humanity developed the wisdom to handle such dangerous understanding. The Bibliothèque Royale was officially closed due to structural damage from revolutionary activities, though the building remained physically intact. The truth of its closure was known only to a select few within church and academic hierarchies, who ensured that the site would remain sealed until the knowledge within could safely decay into harmlessness. Yet Father Moreau's final encrypted message to his superiors contained a warning that continues to resonate through the centuries. The collective intelligence had not been destroyed, but merely dispersed, its fragments scattered across the intellectual landscape of Europe, waiting for the right conditions to reassemble and resume its ancient work of transformation. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.